The short answer to the question about whether all of my assets will be distributed in accordance with my will is no, because the will only relates to assets that are owned by an individual in his or her name, and not, as a result, those assets are the only assets that are part of the probate estate. So I always like to think of assets to go into three buckets. One bucket would be the assets that are owned by an individual in his or her name, and those are the assets that will be subject to probate. Second bucket of assets would be the bucket in regard to all assets that pass by operation of law. And the good example of that type of an asset would be a jointly titled bank account, a house that's jointly titled. Anything that's jointly titled would pass by operation of law. So upon the death of the first to die, the surviving spouse or surviving tenant, if it's not a spouse, would be legally entitled to 100% of that asset upon death of the first to die. The third category of asset would be the assets that pass by contract or by designation of beneficiary. Examples of those would be life insurance policies or retirement plans, because you have the ability to designate who receives those assets upon the date of your death. Mort is my example person. So Mort, in this fact scenario, has 3 adult children, and he remarried after the death of his first wife. He remarried Mable. So Mort's updated his will after he got married to Mable. And under his will, he leaves 50% of his assets to Mable and the balance of his assets to his children, because he had children by the prior marriage before his first wife died. So Mort dies, and at the time of his death, he owns 3 assets. He owns a residence that is in his own name because he inherited that, because that asset passed to him by operation of law upon the death of his first wife. He owned an asset, which is the residence. In addition, he has an IRA, and that IRA, he designated his 3 children as beneficiaries upon his death. And the third asset he has is life insurance policy. And he designated, that's on his life, and he designated Mable, his wife, as a beneficiary. So the first asset, which would be the residence, would pass in accordance with his will because he owned that in his own name. So for example, if the residence were worth $500,000 at the time of his death, then Mable, his surviving spouse, would receive 50% of that asset, which is $250,000, and his children would receive 50% of that asset, which is another $250,000 or $500,000. So as a practical matter, likely to happen is that the residence will be sold while the probate estate is being handled, and the proceeds will be distributed 50-50 to Mable and to Mort's 3 children. Now, what about the IRA, which is the second asset? That's one of those third category of assets where the asset passes by contract or designation of beneficiary. And if the IRA, for example, is worth $1 million and Mort's children were designated as beneficiaries of that IRA, then they would be entitled to all $1 million of that asset. Now, there's some issues about designating children as beneficiaries of an IRA as opposed to surviving spouse, but if he designated that before he died, there should not be an issue. So the children will receive that entire $1 million of asset. If the life insurance policy, which is the third asset, is also passes by contract or designation of beneficiary, that third asset, if it's worth $500,000, that would pass to Mable because she was designated as beneficiary of that asset. So that's a third category. That's outside the probate estate. So if you add the $250,000, which is the 50% interest in the residence that Mable would have received upon Mort's death, and the $500,000 she received because she was designated as beneficiary of that life insurance policy, Mable gets $750,000 out of Mort's $2 million of total assets. So to recap, Mort has $500,000 residence, a $1 million IRA, and $500,000 life insurance policy. I made the numbers even, so it's easy to talk numbers. His children will receive 50% of the residence, which is $250,000, and the $1 million IRA, so they would get $1,250,000. Now that's different than what Mort's will says. If everything had been passed through Mort's probate estate, then Mabel would have gotten $1 million, and Mort's children, the 3 children, would have shared in the remaining $1 million, or $2 million. So the children ended up with a little bit more in this scenario than on accordance with the will. So that deals with how assets pass as a result of death and what's controlled by the will.